but I do know a lot of ELO fans who think that ELO were better than the Beatles, which
I have to
the thing is,
disagree respectfully.
hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video, and today I am once more delighted to be joined by YouTube's one and only Ross Goodall. Hi Ross.
Hi James, how you doing? Great to be on your channel again.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for joining me. So today we're going to do a video which has hopefully an interesting theme. Now, when we first thought of this, I think the idea was that it was going to be, we were going to talk about albums, which if you're a Beatles fan, or if you like the Beatles, then you'll probably like these records and artists. But then I had a slight thing where I wanted to flip it on its head. And I don't know whether it makes any difference really to the meaning of it, but I thought rather than thinking in terms of if you like the Beatles, then you're going to like this, what if we flip it around and we say, if you like this, then there's a good chance that you also like the Beatles. So yes, I'm not entirely sure if that makes any difference whatsoever. I do find this concept interesting, this idea of if you like this music, then you probably like that music. I'm not sure about you, Ross, but I don't tend to find always that it's a very reliable yardstick. So for example, you know, I know people say who like David Bowie, but who don't like Syd Barrett. And I know people who like Bruce Springsteen, but don't like Bob Dylan. So it's not always a surefire thing, is it? Just because you like an artist doesn't necessarily mean you're also going to like the previous artist that really informed that artist. Do you know where I'm coming from with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, like I think like the Bowie Barrett example is a great one, like to make because I'm a big Bowie fan, but I'm not really into that kind of Syd Barrett solo stuff or like his kind of
Mm.
all like Pink Floyd era Barrett, and same with kind of Springsteen and that kind of Tom Petty's compared to Springsteen. Like I'm a massive Tom Petty fan, but I've not really got a lot of time for Bruce Springsteen. Like kind of similar artists, like on like the surface. Like just in terms of like personal preference, sometimes like you just can't like get into them. Yeah.
Would you like to go first and we'll see what we have? And then,
Yeah, sure. So I think for like the first one, I think in terms of artists who were influenced by the Beatles, you can't really go like too far away without mentioning a certain Jeff Lynne. But I didn't want to go for like an obvious one, so I've gone for this album, which is by his first band, The Idle Race, which is their second album. These are just like great quality songs, I think, and like this kind of things like "Come With Me" is the opening track. It's very kind of Penny Lane style, kind of McCartney sort of style song, very melodic and quite charming. And then there's other like the Beatles can even get a mention like on like one of the tracks like Gil at the Window. He mentions them all by name. So it's obviously a very like album like in depth that's like influenced by the Beatles. And I'm just going to show the vinyl for this one because it's quite a special press in this. Actually, it's probably like my prettiest vinyl I own, which is very nice. So yeah, the Idol Race there will be my first pick.
cool. Yes, I have that pressing as well. Yeah, so it's John and Paul and Ringo and George are playing lovely tunes from
Yeah,
the window
yeah,
of her room. Yeah, I mean Jeff Lynne, he was an obvious one. I nearly put On the Third Day by ELO in my list, but I decided not to in the end. I kind of wish I had really. I mean that one is I think is the most Beatlesy record that they ever did. It's got that very dry, sawing sort of cello and quite John Lennon-y vocals, I think, on side one in particular. Songs like
yeah.
Bluebird is Dead and Oh No Not Susan, they have a definite Beatles vibe to them. Going to have to apologise for my first choice because I show this record so often. So I'm going to pick the Motors and Approved by the Motors. They came around in 77, 78 and they hitched a ride on the punk scene, but they were not in any way a ground zero band. And this album has got a lot of very, very Beatlesy harmonies and production touches. And Andy McMaster, the songwriter, has got a McCartney-esque way with a melody, I think. It's not that they sounded massively like the Beatles, but they just, to me, they just are clearly part of that power pop lineage. Strong melodic pop songs with great harmonies and nice production. So had to have it. I do apologize. I'm always showing it. One day I will do one of these videos without showing the Motors, but there we go. That's my first one.
Yeah, excellent. Like we were talking earlier about the kind of different facets, like of like the Beatles and kind of like different, like the sort of like the different styles, like they would kind of like work with. And I guess one style like what doesn't get talked about a lot is the kind of silly songs, like the wacky kind of songs. So things like so things like Bungalow Bill and kind of Maxwell Silver Hammer. And I think this album has some of those. It has like some songs a bit like that on it. So it's a 10cc's debut album here, which definitely for me captures the Beatles' slightly wackier sides. I mean, it is an experimental album, like in some ways, but it's not like Velvet Underground or Pink Floyd experimentation, like experimenting and doing weird things, but within the context of like pop songs, like basically, and like yeah, kind of yeah, like so there's a lot of tracks that got in things like Headline Hustler and the Hospital song, which kind of have like sort of like those kind of tinges of the kind of comical side, which like the Beatles sort of sometimes like lead into, like I think, like but also like some great sort of like things like the Dean and I is sounds like a Lost McCartney classic basically, like others like so like Rubber Bullets, you could imagine them doing saying like the kind of like the Let It Be sessions sort of thing, like Get Back sessions, like so very Beatlesy album. I struggle to see someone who loves this album or 10cc more in general, but like isn't a Beatles fan.
Yeah, it's very clear to me that 10cc were following in that tradition. They were kind of like the musical Monty Python, I always thought.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because George Harrison always used to say that he thought that the spirit of the Beatles had migrated into the Monty Python team because the Python team seemed to have that irreverent kind of way about them. And I think 10cc had that in spades, yeah. Right, this next one is a group that I never listened to back in the day, but I picked up their records in more recent times and I really enjoyed them, really. Just great pop tunes. Short, sharp, and direct. And I think they were known as the female Beatles in some ways. This is the Bangles. They were a four-piece band, all girls, obviously, which is the big difference between them and the Beatles. But there's definitely something Beatley about some of these songs. You know, Hero Takes a Fall, Going Down to Liverpool, of course, name checks Liverpool, where there's a bit of a connection there. And yeah, it's just very, very strong melodies, energetic power pop production. It's sort of like Please Please Me, the album. Done by women 20 years later with a completely different background and a different production style. Even the name, the Bangles, the Beatles, you've got the B thing there. I don't know, there's something about it which is a bit Beatley to me.
Next one for me is a kind of personal pick, and it's an album which I guess probably not a lot of people are familiar with, but for me, I just want to shout about it and rave about it because it's so good, and it definitely has these kind of Beatlesy touches on it. So it's by like the Lilac Time, and it's called And Love for All. This is like their third album. This was a bit of a change in direction for them. It was produced by Andy Partridge, which will probably pluck up like your like interest like a little bit. It's a kind of all out kind of 60s kind of psychedelic kind of pop album basically, like but like there's some great songs on it, like I mean tracks like Fields, like the opening track has these kind of slightly Indian kind of vibes to it, which sort of like remind me quite a bit like sort of like the influence that George Harrison brought to like kind of like that mid-period Beatles. And then like I Love for All is like kind of an update like on like All You Need Is Love, and then there's other tracks like which are a bit more psychedelic, a bit dark, like Strawberry Fields Forever kind of feels them. But no, an all-round great record, and like one I would urge people to check out. Like,
Stephen Tintin Duffy.
yeah, Stephen Duffy, yeah.
So it's interesting how you get these very British songwriters who've got the Beatles thing going on, but you've got the Americans as well, because of course the Beatles were huge in America from 64 onwards and had such a huge effect. Now, I don't know if this guy is known as being a Beatlesy type songwriter, but to me, when I listen to his music, I can definitely hear a lot of McCartney in his work. I don't know if you know him, but it's Marshall Crenshaw.
Never heard of him actually. No.
Came around in the late 1970s. He's made a few albums. This is the only one that I've ever heard. Think Elvis Costello, definitely. I mean, he's got that kind of sharp new wave image there and the glasses and everything, but the songs are just very direct, very, very, very melodic, great harmonies. And again, it's interesting, you know, that era, the sort of new wave era where things were all supposed to be new and different, and we were breaking away from the past and everything. And yet so many of these artists, you know, think of Costello, think of the Jam, etc., they were of the age to have been big Beatles fans back in the, say, you know, the mid to late 60s. So of course it was going to come out. There was no way that you were going to bury that tradition. It's just called Marshall Crenshaw. It's his debut.
So sticking with like an American theme here, this is a band, Big Star, early 70s kind of stuff. A bit like they kind of flopped like at like the time. Oh, was that one of your picks as well?
Yeah. As we go, if we cross over, we might as well just, you know, go for it. So yeah, I had this quite late in my list. I had it at number 2.
I think this is the only album which has both Alex Chilton and Chris Bell on it, and they were kind of like when this album came out and like it was getting like reviewed, it was reviewing like quite well. Like they were often compared to like kind of like Lennon like a McCartney, like in like some ways, like you know, like the band like never like kind of like took off like commercially. And there's some very Beatlesy song I would pick out, like the Ballad of El Goodo, very across the university. That song I think like there was a great depth like to like that. It's just like perfect power pop, and I think it just kind of like you're into this. Like yeah, like God knows why you're not into the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, this album really came into its own in the 1990s. You know, during the 90s, you had these bands like Oasis and Blur who were really mining a very deep seam, not just of the Beatles, but of whatever, you know, the Small Faces and all those bands. And then Big Star were kind of they were also seen as an influence, but less for the kind of Brit-poppy things, more for the mid-60s jangly sound. And
Mhm,
like you say, just great songwriting, brilliant vocal harmonies,
mhm.
and just an aesthetic really, which, as you say, it's difficult to imagine somebody being really into Big Star, but then saying that they've got no time for the Beatles at all. That wouldn't
Yeah.
really compute for me. Right now, I suspect you may have this bunch in your list as well, because I know that you're a fan. You're probably more of a fan of them than I am, because I was never a fan of them back when I was a kid. But in later years, I did grow to like them more. This is my favorite album by them. And this is the jam. This is the
Yeah.
jam
Mhm,
and
mhm,
sound
mhm.
effects, which I couldn't not have. Does it start? Which is the
Well,
song which
Start's the one which rips off Taxman,
Taxman.
so obviously
Yeah.
that's a definite link there, yeah.
But this album, I don't know whether it's known as being their most Beatlesy one, but to me it sounds most like 1966 Revolver. It's
Yeah.
got that experimental sound to it. Paul Weller was starting to flex his muscles in the studio, I suppose, moving away from that kind of agit, punky
Mhm.
kind of sound which he had on the first couple of
They
albums.
do a great cover like of like "And Your Bird Can Sing" and a
Yes.
few Kink songs as well. So it's obviously that's what he was thinking about, like like when like they were recording it. So it's probably like not too much of a coincidence that it does come out
Hmm.
quite Beatlesy, yeah. So my next one is a bit more obscure. It's a bit more recent as well. It's a band called Field Music. And this is the album Tones of Town. And this one just really like their Sunderland duo. They've released music since about 2006, so this is their second album here. And it's yeah, probably this is probably like the most Beatles-esque. I think it's very inventive, this album, in terms of like it's like arrangements and tight harmonies, and you've got clever use of kind of strings like on here, like as well. But also like hummable melodies. It is just very Beatlesy for me, like like songs like yeah, Closer at Hand and like the opening track Give It, Lose It, Take It, as these like so many have lots of different sections to them and stuff. So I think this kind of touches on like that kind of clever side that the Beatles had, like as well. So yeah, like a good one there for people to check out.
Right, okay. Now, this next one occurred to me quite late in the process of trying to pick and choose, and it's one which it's an album which it's very British. I mean, specifically, it's quite Welsh in a way, which is a bit of an odd thing to talk about with the Beatles because they were from just a few miles north of of North Wales. But I thought I would include it as a maybe a slightly offbeat, interesting one. This is John Cale and Paris 1919. So John Cale, obviously, he was the guy from the Velvet Underground, their viola player on the first two albums, and he was famous for this very screechy, vaguely unlistenable, avant-garde kind of thing sound. But when he left the Velvet, he made quite a few albums that were much more melodic than anybody had expected him to do.
Mhm,
And this one, which I think is produced by Chris Thomas, this album, it's a kind of Baroque orchestral pop record with just beautiful sweeping melodies.
mhm,
And it's got that air of wistful nostalgia, I suppose, which links it back to me to 67 Beatles, that kind of John Lennon thing,
mhm,
where you're looking back at your childhood. There's a song on the record. It starts out Child's Christmas in Wales. And of course, he was
mhm,
from South Wales, and it's got a very kind of festive, nostalgic, rose-tinted kind of view of Britain, I suppose, and Wales.
mhm,
And I don't know if Cale was a Beatles fan. I don't think Lou Reed was. I don't think there's much of a.
mhm,
Don't think there's much love lost really between Velvet's fans, say, and Beatles fans. You often find
mhm,
people who are really into the Velvet Underground fairly dismissive of the Beatles and everything because the Velvets were the kind of alternative, weren't they? The
mhm.
Beatles are the mainstream and the Velvets are the alternative. But I think John Cale in the 70s, he wasn't really interested in continuing down that road. I think he wanted to demonstrate that he was a really good mainstream songwriter, and this is definitely his most mainstream work.
So my next one is probably the opposite from like a lot of like my other picks, where it's like all the other ones are like artists inspired by the Beatles and albums which sound like the Beatles. But this one is one which inspired the Beatles, which is what I think is why Beatles fans should own it, basically. And it's a bit of an obvious one. It's their Pet Sounds by like the Beach Boys. So of course, this was the kind of the influence on Sergeant Pepper, and I think it is just that fact alone, which I think that sort of means that like Beatles fans like should like own like this album. And similarly, people like who are really into this album, I think should be able to find similarities like in places between this like and Pepper, like just in terms of like the sheer like inventiveness and like creative genius like of like both like the artists in question.
Now, I know Beatles fans who really don't like that album. I can think of at least two or three. I've seen almost sort of rant videos from people who are
Mm,
really, really into the Beatles and just are totally dismissive of Pet Sounds.
yeah.
And to me, it doesn't make any sense because Paul
Mm.
McCartney, I think it's his favorite album of all time, isn't it?
God
Favorite
Only
song.
Knows, he said many a times, is his
Yeah.
favorite song. I'm not sure about album, but certainly the song God Only Knows It is one
Yeah.
of his favorites. I think maybe the one thing what could be or one of the reasons why people is because that's got session players on that album. You know, it's all like these top notch LA session players. It's not a band. It's not like the Beatles where it was just four guys that do like all the work. So maybe it's that kind of thing what is kind of put some people off, like the fact that it isn't um like the band playing like their own instruments, like these LA session guys, sort of being directed like by Brian Wilson rather than like the Beatles kind of way of working.
Good stuff. Right. I quite like the way that we haven't crossed over too much so far, just been the one record so far. Now, I know you're not going to have this one because we've talked about this guy. I think it's yourself I've talked to about him. It might be somebody else, I'm not sure.
Mhm.
I had to have this one. Todd Rundgren, Something Anything. I mean, Todd has got a vast back catalogue. It's very intimidating to collect him. It's almost like a parallel universe Paul McCartney album. And I say parallel universe because to me, his melodic sensibility is pretty much the same. And this album is his soft rock masterpiece, really. And the songs on it have a definite McCartney vibe to them, no question about it, that kind of piano-led thing. But his frames of reference are quite different, I think. He was into the British scene, he was into the Beatles, but he was also heavily into Philly soul. And I know the Beatles were big soul fans, but Todd Rundgren's got a slightly different twist to his music. He's got different influences going on. So it's like a sort of parallel universe Beatles where you've got this guy who's sort of like, he's the McCartney figure in this other universe, and he's got the same sort of talent that McCartney's got, and the same way with the tune, and the same. I mean, also he can produce himself. He plays all the instruments, that kind of thing. That that classic thing that McCartney did with his two or his three solo albums. Sort of different set of influences and a slightly different artistic remit, but definitely running in parallel.
My next one is an 80s album. It is Crowded House. I mean, like Neil Finn's a very kind of very like McCartney-esque songwriter, you know, like sort of great melodies, universal kind of songs, things like Don't Dream It's Over have a kind of very similar kind of feel to things like Let It Be and that, you know, with this kind of very sing-along kind of chorus and that, what or like kind of like everyone like can kind of like get into and that. And like just his voice as well is very pleasing, like on like the air, and it's quite a versatile voice as well. Like he can do the ballads, but when he does a rocker, he also has a bit of oomph like in there, like as well. So I think it's that kind of like that versatility, like that he has, like also like just like like just like so many like great songs like on here. So that's my next one.
Now, there is one band that I need to check out. Right, well, my next one is a group that I know you like. In fact, you've just done a video on them. So without further ado, could not leave out Squeeze. And I picked Eastside Story, suppose probably because of the Elvis Costello connection. Costello co-produced the record. Obviously, Costello is a big Beatles fan. Squeeze themselves, of course, are big Beatles fans. Now, I don't know with this record whether there was a deliberate attempt to go more Beatlesy, but to my ears, that sounds like what they did. I think it's that thing of having lots of different styles of music, because Squeeze, up until this point, they had one style of music really, which was that kind of pub rock edging into new wave kind of sound. But on this record, they really explored the gamut. You had Labeled with Love, which is a country song, soul music with Tempted. And I think really it was Costello trying to get them to think of themselves for the first time, really, as a studio outfit. You've got the tag, the classic Difford and Tilbrook, where the new Lennon and McCartney, whatever the tag was, which again is one of those reasons why I'd have to have them in. There they are, Squeeze.
That it definitely has more of a kind of Beatlesy feel to it, simply because there's so many styles on it than some of like the earlier albums where there were glimmers of it, but they just didn't have the consistency like in quality like the Beatles had. I would say Eastside Story does have the consistency. Now my next one was kind of tribute album in some ways to like the Beatles. I think the artist like has said it's Billy Joel's The Nylon Curtain here. Now this is my favorite Billy Joel album. I'm not a massive fan of Billy Joel, but this album just really clicked with me, and I think it was because it is very Beatlesy. Like it was 1982 this came out, so sort of like what was that, like a year like after like John Lennon's death. So I think that possibly played into it like a little bit. But there's songs on here like things like Laura has a very kind of I Am the Walrus kind of feel with these kind of swooping strings, and just his vocals very Lennon-y. And then there's things like Goodnight Saigon, which has a kind of this grandiose nature, like of like Abbey Road, things like Carry That Way. It kind of feels it's got like that kind of like that like the sort of like the big orchestration on there, like and like just like all round like sort of like quite grand sound. And then there's stuff like Scandinavian Skies, which is probably my favorite on here, with all these kind of backward strings and stuff going on, very Strawberry Fields Forever kind of feel to it. So all round a very Beatlesy album, and like one which like yeah, like even if like you're not a big fan of Billy Joel, like I'm not a massive fan, like I really, really love this album. So yeah, that's my next one.
Interesting. I didn't see that coming at all.
Mhm.
Billy Joel, I've got one of his albums. It's the big famous one. I can't remember what.
Stranger.
Maybe The Stranger. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've always quite liked him. I've always liked
Mhm.
his hits. I used to love putting his songs on the jukebox. I
Nice.
should check him out. I do like what I've heard. So he goes on my list.
Two
Okay.
left.
Now this one again, I'm going to show two records for this because the one that I think is most Beatlesy is their second album, which I've got on CD only. The first album is Beatlesy, but it also has lots of other reference points to it as well. It's quite a famous album in the legends of power pop music. This is Jellyfish and Belly Button. Are you aware of this one?
Can't say I'm familiar with it now.
This came out in 1991, I think, and
Okay.
it totally and utterly flopped. And the reason for that was that it was just not the right music at the right
Mhm.
time. Because
Mhm.
in the early 90s, you had all the grunge scene was breaking and just
Yeah.
things going on like that. Nobody wanted to know about Beatlesy stuff. I saw a review of this record in Q magazine and instantly rushed out to buy it immediately that day because it was during that period, like I said, when all this other stuff was around. Nobody liked my kind of music anymore. And I read a review of this saying, if you like 10cc, Supertramp, ELO, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and something else, you will love this album.
Mhm.
So I was like, right, shit. Instantly just went to the record shop, bought it, brought it home, and just loved it immediately. But it's got some other influences too, maybe a bit of Cheap Trick, maybe a bit of this, a bit of that. This one is
Mhm.
pure 67 Magical Mystery Tour, Sergeant Pepper. It's full of strings, backward tape loops,
Mhm.
all those keyboards that you know from those records. What's the keyboard
Mhm.
called? The Mellotron, isn't it?
Mellotron, yeah, yeah.
Mellotron, yeah. You would love them both, Ross. You must get them. I don't know how available they are anymore. Maybe on CD you can pick them up quite cheaply on Amazon. Not sure about vinyl, but they're kind of
Oh,
known now.
yeah.
The two guys from the band went on to they guested on, or they wrote songs for Ringo on his Time Takes Time record. And there's a couple of other Beatles connections which they had later
Mhm.
on, but they're kind of known as being one of those bands that Beatles fans tend to like. And I would be
Right.
very surprised if any Jellyfish fans did not like the Beatles. It would be truly bizarre that.
Mhm. So my next one is another. It is one from that kind of era, kind of 90s sort of era, and it's Teenage Fan Club. One
Ah,
for like their album there, like songs from Northern Britain, and this one like in particular, again, I was going through like the few albums like that I own from them, and this one for me is definitely the most kind of Beatlesy in the sense that very tight harmonies on there. It reminds me a lot of like the early Beatles. So like the songs are quite simple, quite direct. Like like there's not a lot of kind of like all like the picks I've had before have the kind of psychedelic touches or like lots of big strings on there. There's none of that on here. It's just very straight ahead. Like yeah, that really reminds me a lot of like that kind of like early kind of Hard Day's Night of era Beatles, I think. So yeah,
mm.
that's my next one.
I really like Teenage Fan Club. I discovered them back
Mhm.
in the early 90s when I think it was their second album came out. That would have been Bandwagon-esque.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because that was right on the cusp of those Britpop bands coming
Mhm.
through. I think it came out the same year as Leisure by Blur, but
Yeah,
it
it did.
seemed to have a more classicist thing, so that it had that kind of 1970s sound to it, a bit of Wings, a bit of just very, very melodic McCartney stuff going on.
Mhm.
Maybe less concerned with attitude and more concerned with great tunes. And they were quite
Mhm.
clever in the early career because they melded it with quite a heavy guitar
Well, the reason
sound.
why I chose that one like, in particular was because they kind of softened it down a bit. Because Bangles it's a great album, but there's much less of a Beatlesy flavour of that, just because the guitars are so
Right.
loud and like in like your face in places. Whereas that one, it's the toned down, but it's
Mm.
not boring either.
Good
So
stuff. Well, I'm at number one now, and I picked this record deliberately because I had a feeling you were going to pick it. So this was my attempt at trying to coincide. And I know
okay.
you've got one left, so it'd be interesting to see if this is the one. Now, I chose it because I do think it's very, very Beatlesy, and I think deliberately so. Comes from the
Mhm.
80s again, and it's one where I hear the Beatles coming through, maybe 66 Beatles, Revolver era, very, very clearly. And I think it's kind of known for being that, and it is the Rain Parade.
Okay. Uh-huh.
This is not your number one then.
It's not my number one, no,
Right,
but
interesting.
I didn't even think about it, but then I suppose, yeah, I could certainly see that, yeah.
There's one song on the record, I don't
Mhm.
remember which one it is, but it's got a very similar sound to "And Your Bird Can Sing." It's got these
Mm.
two guitars going through playing kind of harmonies, and the
Mhm.
production on the guitars is that kind of metallic shimmer. I don't know, I mean, I just heard it for the first time. I was almost disappointed, and the reason for that was I'd heard so much about this band and how great they were. I
Mhm.
think I was expecting it to be less derivative. And when I
Mm.
listened to it, I kind of thought, yeah, it's good. I like it, but it's almost like it's constantly reminding me of other things all the time.
Mhm.
And I don't know, maybe I maybe need to spend a bit more time with it to maybe hear what's meant to be so truly great about it. I do like it. I do really rate it. I know you ranked it your favorite album, didn't you? Whichever year it was,
Yeah,
1983.
83, yeah. Again,
Yeah.
it's a bit subjective. I think I can certainly see what you're saying about it being a bit derivative, and I guess a lot of the kind of Paisley Underground bands of that kind of era,
Mm,
then like the 3 o'clock, like the Long Riders, they all kind of took a different slice of kind of the 60s influence and then kind of melded it into like their own kind of like sound on that. But I think that's a good mix of kind of like, yeah, Revolver era Beatles, but then also kind of like there's songs on there which the Beatles would never do, like a lot more adventurous kind of songs in terms of like their length and that. There's tracks there about 6, 7 minutes, so it's like they are going in a slightly different place, but
mm,
like certainly rooted in that kind of like Revolver era kind of like guitar sound, like in particular, like on like a few tracks. Yeah, I didn't rank these, so this one, whether you can say this is my number one or not, I don't really know. But again, it's a bit more like off an obscure one. It's a guy called Emmett Rhodes, and
ah,
it's
yeah.
a 60s album, this, and this guy is often referred to as the one man Beatles, like, you know, so this is his, I think it's his debut album, entirely self, like recorded in like a home studio basically. And like at the time, I think a lot of people, again, I'm not sure whether this got a lot of praise like at the time, again, I really don't know much about him, like, but certainly like kind of years since, a lot of people think this is the kind of album that McCartney should have come out with like in
Mm,
1970, because it is got like that kind of like that lush songwriting, very melodic, rather than kind of just like the scrappy like instrumentals like we got like on like McCartney. This one is just like pure like kind of like pop magic. Like, yeah, like very lush, lots of nice kind of strings, but all kind of keyboard strings and that. Like live, but it sounds great, and yeah, really, really, really fantastic record. So that would be like my like last pick there.
great choice. So I've never heard that album, and
Hmm.
but I know, yeah, I know about it. I've heard people talking
Hmm.
about it over and over again. I have looked for it. I've just never found a copy of it, and I don't
Hmm.
think I've even streamed it. So I might just do that this afternoon. Right. So viewers, I hope you enjoyed that. We hope you enjoyed that. So let us know. So just going back to what we said at the start. So what we want to know from you is, well, do you like any of those records for a start? And if you do like any of them, let us know. Do you also like the Beatles? We'd be very interested to
Hmm.
know if you're a big fan of any of those, but have no time for the Fab Four whatsoever. Or conversely, you love the Beatles and there's one of those records we showed that you just think, oh, no way, you know. So thank you very much, Ross, for joining me. Very enjoyable chat.
Yep,
Thank
no, it's
you.
been fantastic. Thanks for having me on again.
No worries. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.
Thanks, bye bye.